we'll see how this goes. All right. Hello, everyone. Hang on. I've got to fix the levels. Hang on.
No
This happened
worries.
last time. Uh, Hello, everyone. Welcome to this In Plain English live stream. I'm your host, Jamie Moffa, and today we're going to be doing a follow-up conversation with Dr. Neuro about the most recent episode of the podcast, which was on what causes multiple sclerosis. So, Dr. Neuro, for those of us watching who haven't who haven't listened to the podcast yet, do you want to give a quick introduction on who you are and like what your background is?
Sure thing. I'm Dr. Neuro. I am a medical science communicator. I typically work within Twitter and Twitch and sometimes Instagram, but I am spreading my hands out into different areas. But I typically talk about infectious diseases. I believe as a recap from our last episode, we actually discussed a paper that just came out like it's actually not a few months ago. It's about a year ago right now. It feels the pandemic really screws with your time frame. And it was actually a fantastic paper that looked at what a possible cause of multiple sclerosis was, linking it to what we know as the Epstein-Barr virus. And it was actually a very well done paper from an epidemiology side, and also just in general, like looking at it from a cellular perspective and from a population level perspective. And I know that in our last podcast, we had definitely had some follow up questions on that one. So it's kind of a very quick recap of what we did last time.
Yeah, and really quickly, Epstein-Barr virus people might know as one of the viruses that causes mono. So
Correct.
that's kind of what it's infamous for.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and maybe you can talk a little bit about like what made this paper so special and why you decided to choose it for this episode.
Yeah, no, I think one of the big reasons why I chose this paper was one, one of the things from those of us who are very familiar with kind of Epstein-Barr virus. So, um, and again, this is one of those things that like let's kind of take a step back for when we look at it. Like Epstein-Barr virus just in general is actually very well spread amongst the population. It's just chances of most people probably having it are probably like a very high percentage. It is also known as the kissing disease as well. It is spread via saliva, bodily fluid, hence why like we get the disease. And most of us probably would have been infected by it at one point or another, or most of us will probably have been asymptomatic. Chances of anyone getting symptomatic probably very minimal. But what we do notice is that there have been some cases where those who do have Epstein-Barr virus progress into mononucleosis, or what we know as mono. That's where obviously it can cause a little bit of chaos and a lot of issues. But again, for mono, just to keep in mind as well, that's like one method to as it could result into, but
Mm-hmm.
it can be multiple methods. But what we started taking a look at too is we've noticed that there was a link between those who had Epstein-Barr virus and those who eventually had developed multiple sclerosis. And the problem is that it's very hard to develop that link without doing a very what we call longitudinal, like kind of like long-term analysis and looking at like, okay, well, what do we look at from those who have had Epstein-Barr and then like tracking across different time frames. And the reason why I picked this paper was that it did exactly that. And what the paper does as well, that's I really love, was it really checked itself to make sure that it's like, okay, well, are we sure it's Epstein-Barr virus? Could it be something else? Could it be cytomegalovirus? Could it be COVID? Could it be flu? Could it be something else? Right. And um, they systematically like kind of check their biases, make sure to like, okay, well, are we kind of biasing ourselves? Are we thinking about this too limited? And it really, really honed in on the fact that, hey, there is a very, very strong link between those who have, the Epstein-Barr virus that can get reactivated by the way. So those of us who've had Epstein-Barr virus didn't really feel it, didn't really see much of it. It could go dormant and essentially have a latent infection, and it could spring up back again, especially when you have an acute infection of some kind. And it is very likely that what we're seeing in situations like that, that this might be the link from that perspective.
Yeah, that's actually I actually didn't know that Epstein-Barr virus could get reactivated.
Yep.
So that's good to know. Um, I also wanted to ask. So I know that just like from a baseline level of knowledge about multiple sclerosis, I know that there are different types of MS.
Hmm.
And I was curious about whether this link with Epstein Barr was present for all presentations of MS or if it was a particular type. And maybe you could also like go over a little bit of background on the fact that there are different types of MS.
Yeah, so I think the study really didn't it didn't matter what type of MS they were looking at, because overall in general, that fact is that we the focus of it was really from understanding whether if it led to MS in general. Obviously, there further studies would need to be done to take a look at to see like what are if there are specific types of MS that this could obviously, develop into. But in situations like this, I don't think that they were probably looking very specific into like what
Mm-hmm.
type of MS, but they definitely did a signal that that was basically the situation right there.
Got it. Okay.
And then
So,
you also ask a question about the types, right? I believe.
yeah. Yeah, if you could just go over that for our
Uh,
listeners.
yeah, yeah, absolutely. So, in terms of like when we look at this, so to kind of brief background, so this is a neurodegenerative disease
Mm-hmm.
that basically focuses on what happens is that your own immune system kind of targets the kind of nerve cells or neurons, and what they specifically target is the fatty tissue, which is that myelin sheath that's really important to keeping your nerves kind of like making sure that it's working properly. Nutrients are provided. It's a critical component of it. And what we start to see is that that starts to degrade over time, and it obviously that cascades into multiple symptoms for that. But in terms of again, when we look at different types of MS, it's usually based on like how people's disease progresses. And that's so you have different like relapsing, primary progressive, and secondary progressive, where it's so if we're looking at in this case like primary like progressive or relapse, let's actually go relapsing progressive
Mm-hmm.
MS. These are unpredictable, like unpredictable attacks, which may leave like kind of essentially like permanent issues, like for period and then periods of remission, and then back and forth. But there's no kind of like rhyme or reason to it.
Mm-hmm.
Primary progressive again is like if someone is kind of like you see kind of like a steady like increase of that disability as a result of MS, that could result from that. And then you have secondary, which is again like where there's initially like kind of like a wave, and then like there's like a huge kind of like remission period where it's just kind of like dormant for a long
Mm-hmm.
period of time and then comes back in and then comes back out. It's a little bit more predictable versus that of the relapsing remitting one, but you do see like kind of like that type of situation. And you even have like stuff like progressive relapsing MS as well, which is again where that each episode, even though there is a remission, like each episode just gets worse, right? Like when
Mm.
you have these episodes of MS and it just keeps climbing and climbing and climbing. But overall, in general, the types of MS, it's like MS is present in all of them, right? So we know
Yeah.
that it's happening. It's more about how the patient presents themselves, versus like like whatever it might be. And to be fair, like and again, like to be clear about it, we still don't have a very clear understanding of what does cause this kind of disease in general. We have
Mm-hmm.
very strong hypotheses like this one paper we're talking about, but in general, it's a very difficult thing to kind of like nail down. So,
Yeah. What are some of the so obviously from the paper there's a strong link between EBV and MS. Is there
mhm.
other research on like other factors that are linked as well?
um, so I mean, we do look at other factors too. Like we do look. I think that we had other autoimmune diseases we're investigating that might be like lead to situations like that. I mean, even COVID, for example, is
Mm-hmm.
something we're taking a look into, right? Because we still don't have full understanding of impacts of that. And it's all wide and varied, but EBV is actually one of, I would say, the strongest contender out
Mm.
of all of it, because like even before we had really kind of like settle in on this paper, like there was a lot of talks in the community about looking at this specific disease as kind of like the case based on kind of a epidemiological evidence, and saying like, okay, well, we do notice there's some sort of trend and maybe we should look into it. So
Yeah. I mean, it sounds like there really needs to be a lot more research into like
absolutely.
different factors that might contribute. Yeah.
Hmm. Yeah, and to add on to that, like one of the I think one of the many things that people have to, if there's any kind of like theme I would like people to understand when we look at scientific papers, is that it's very rare that you find blockbuster papers, as I like to call
Mm.
it, where it's like truly like we have found the cure or we have found the cause
Mm-hmm.
of whatever it might be, right? What we end up doing is finding like bits and pieces of a puzzle, and this paper finds a very huge piece of the puzzle. Like we found like all the corner pieces right now.
Nice.
And as
Yeah.
I like to think about it. So now what we can start doing is let's start building inward. Let's form the picture right now, because we have such a strong link right there that it's almost like indisputable at this point that EBV is one key cause,
Mm-hmm.
right? And we can obviously in this case scenario push for a more additional funding or additional kind of research into being like, okay, now students, we know that this is a situation. Let's figure out what can we do, like from an intervention perspective. What can we do? What can we figure out from EBV, that what's the key component in there that might be causing it, right?
Yeah.
We it's one of those things that like we have, it's good papers bring out better questions. That's a sign of a good paper. And this paper does. And so I think that we have to understand that it's not always about the answers, it's about better questions.
Yeah. Yeah. It's like, you're not necessarily looking for a paper that says we solved it. You're looking for a paper that's like, well, now we have this bit, and that opens up like five new questions about, you know.
Yeah.
So
And
what
if it
it,
is something we solve, we usually are very skeptical. We're always like, what?
yeah. Yeah. Like, oh, it almost like brings more scrutiny if a paper is like, ah, yes, we solved this, because then you're like,
Yeah.
oh, there,
Yep.
we know this is really complex.
Yeah.
I,
Absolutely.
I feel like it's similar to cancer, where I like the sort of very surface level, like, understanding is like, ah, scientists are researching a cure to cancer, like
Mm-hmm.
all of it. And then I think one of the things that surprised me, like when I started doing my undergrad in like biology, and then obviously even more so into medical school, was like cancer is 5,000 different things.
It
Which,
is.
yeah.
And 5,000 different things with five different possible ways that could result in it. And um, we we'd be lucky to start eliminating them one by one. And it's just a very difficult problem set to really solve.
Yeah, for sure. I guess I was wondering, like, what do you know about the research now that's trying to fill in those puzzle pieces? Like, what are some interesting directions that you're seeing?
um, so one of the big ones that I think is actually is very prudent for us to think about, and um, is so when we look at kind of a disease research perspective, right? We need to think about like what can we do about solving situations where people do have EBV right now? What can we do about preventing future EBV infections?
Mm-hmm.
What can we figure out? What's the link between EBV and MS? And then the bottom up is just like, okay, so what can we do to stop EBV from progressing to this, right? And so that all of those pieces are kind of like right now being filled in. But I think from a low hanging fruit, what we're seeing a lot of people do, and what I see a lot of kind of like what they're thinking about right now is looking at an Epstein-Barr virus vaccine. um, and kind of looking into that, because again, like if we can prevent future infections for those, chances of that would obviously dramatically reduce chances of them obviously having that progress to MS. um, I will again state again like the situation with EBV, because I know this actually scared a lot of people when this
Mm-hmm.
paper first came out, because you know, a lot of people do have EBV. A
Yeah.
lot of people have had it once or twice, maybe multiple times. And the thing is that like not all cases of EBV say that three times fast progresses to MS. And I think one of the things we want to note is that there are probably, and this paper actually did a really good job because they said it's not just EBV, but there might be a third factor here we're not thinking about. There might be some genetic factor, and they even talk about that with that specific gene. I can't remember on top of my head, and a couple of other things that could drive this specific infection to become like
Yeah.
that become MS. And so I think part of it is really understanding where that missing link is right now. So that's another one is like saying like, okay, well, now that we know that there is this, we have one end piece to another, let's start trying to figure that out. And so there is some research behind that from immunologists. I think some people are doing it in Cambridge. I don't remember the exact
Mm.
names of, and obviously like there's drive to obviously look at from a vaccine perspective, and then I think treatment's going to be a little more difficult again because again it's very difficult to just simply say like, okay, well, we're just going to treat everyone for EBV, where when if you think about it from a population perspective, majority of folks probably have had EBV but don't really develop anything, right?
Yeah.
So it's kind of hard to really sell people to be like, okay, well, you need to get this treatment because even though nothing happened and it
Yeah.
might not happen, it's one of those things that's like it could be a very difficult thing for people to sell on. So
Right. And also like utilizing resources towards trying to treat everybody for something when the like actual population that's the most at risk is smaller. And so we could target
yeah,
it to a smaller population.
yep, absolutely.
Yeah. I think that's very smart, like from a public health standpoint, especially I think coming off of like the height of COVID, I
Mm-hmm.
feel like I'm not sure, but I feel like in some sense there's a bit of a weariness about like the constant, obviously it's very important to get vaccinated against COVID, to get vaccinated against the flu, but like I feel like there's a
Sure.
weariness of like we have to do another thing. We have to do another thing.
Yeah, and one of the things that, and I touched on this last time, is that I think people are more aware now that there are infectious diseases in the world.
Mm.
There are lots of scary things out there. And, I always have to remind people that these infectious diseases have actually had many outbreaks prior to COVID ever happening. We've had outbreaks many times, right? Like Marburg virus. Remember that's happening right now in Africa between Tanzania and
Mm-hmm.
Equatorial Guinea. It's been happening for quite some time. Uh, Nipah virus, or listeria. Like there's always these. I mean, there's so many things that we actually, as in developed nations, are very lucky because we don't have to think about this. And now that COVID's kind of rampaged and it's kind of broken down that safety net of ours, we're starting to see the reality of the situation, which is the fact that we as a global community are inundated with outbreaks a lot of times. And those of us in the infectious disease world are very tired in general.
Yeah.
But the thing is that like it's a never ending battle to work on this because it is one of those things where the world is not truly equal in many aspects, right? And we talk about inequality in many ways, and global health is one of the biggest things, right? A global health inequality. And that has really stemmed in terms of like looking at infectious disease and understanding that we are going to continue fighting these. And obviously, like from us in like Canada, United States, or in European countries, we complain and we get wary, which is rightfully so, about all these news about like, okay, well, you might need a second bivalent booster, you might need this, you might need that. And I you know I always have to remind many folks that like you as a baby, or you until the age of 5, you have a schedule. You should look at your childhood schedule, vaccination schedule, because all of those vaccinations you are required to get are there to protect you against a lot of nasty things out there that you don't want to have. And we're going to continue doing that to make sure that obviously that regimen continues happening, and make sure that diseases like measles don't make a comeback like on a grand scale, that
Yeah.
polio doesn't make a comeback on a grand scale. And um but we're starting to see that erosion, right? Because people are starting to get weary, and we've had outbreaks of polio in parts of the U.S. already, and we've had measles outbreaks around parts of the U.S. And um, it's just one of the things I have to remind everyone: we have to continue doing this because it's a war of attrition amongst the disease. Because the disease
Yeah.
doesn't get tired. It's gonna continue doing what it's doing. It's just like, I don't care. I mean, I know
Right.
it's a holiday, but I got stuff to do.
Right. It's a virus. It does not like ascribe to our
No.
understanding of being tired. I also want to
Or daylight savings.
or daylight savings time. Oh my god. I also want to encourage anybody who's watching. This is a Q&A that is intended for the listeners even more so than just me. So I encourage you to go ahead and put your questions in the chat. Anything that you want to know about what we've been talking about so far.
Absolutely. And it could just not, it doesn't even have to be Epstein-Barr virus too, if you want to know just in general what's happening. But no, I really, like, again, like, when we did this podcast the last time, which I do encourage everyone, please, to really check that out, because there were some um, really good questions, actually. I think there was a couple of ones I remember you and your team had sent, and I was like, oh, I might have to think on this one. And I think one of the many things that people, we really highlighted at the end was just like, okay, well, if something were to come out of this, like, what's the timeline of it developing into like a successful vaccine or things like
Mm-hmm.
that? And I always have to remind that, and I actually do this for a lot of my audience and my friends as well, is that, like, um COVID, we got spoiled by COVID because we saw something come out in clinical trials, and doing trials during COVID was actually the easiest thing, right? Because we literally could, if you wanted to do a trial, it's just like, okay, well, we need people who are vulnerable to COVID. You literally can cover your eyes and point anywhere, and there's like
Right.
your popular. You could grab a random subset of people, and perfect. And it was so, we had so much resources and so many people working on the same problem set, and it was I would say, like, that's like one of the big golden eras of just like, when we look at vaccine research, because the global community really came together to do this. But that's a situation that we don't normally see in many other, like, diseases, right? Like, we don't see them in many other factors because of the fact that there just is not a huge global drive. Governments are not as willing to shell out tons of money for these problems, and it's also just something, again, like, where, like, if it starts to wane in like developing countries, then the interest, kind of like, the spotlight gets off of it, and we just end up not caring too much about the problem set. Um, the biggest example I would say right now is, like, for example, long COVID. We
Mm-hmm.
don't really talk about it too much, and we need to, because there's so much we really do not understand that problem, and we need to be better about trying to figure out, for those who have recovered from acute infections of COVID, where does that lead? And in situations such as, remember, EBV to MS is a good example of where, like, people who might have EBV and might have progressed to an infection and recovered, what might be the possible like repercussions down the line. We just found out right now, and so it's kind of like, we do need much more continued investment in that factor.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm seeing a question in the chat. Does
Sure.
MS only affect CNS neurons versus peripheral nerves?
Uh, it's both, actually. Part of it really is just kind of like looking at, again, like, what we start to see is that, like, for MS, is that it does start to progress outwards. We're not just like, CNS, central nervous system, but we do see it out in the peripheral nervous system as well. But more so, much within the central nervous system as well. Um, Hopefully that answered your question on that one.
Yeah, I mean,
Happy
I'm
to.
thinking like from a clinical standpoint, the sort of classical thing you see is one of those like MRI brain scans,
Mhm.
and you can see like little
Yeah.
lesions in it that are,
Yeah.
I'm guessing, like, is that actually seeing the demyelination happening on the
Yep.
brain scan?
You do see demyelination, and then also, just in general, like, those neurons essentially kind of dying as a result of it,
Mm,
right? Because they're kind of not getting the nutrients that they need. They're essentially, you're kind of like isolating them, because essentially they don't have anything to communicate afterwards, and just kind of like die on their own. It's just very sad if you say it out loud.
Yeah.
But it is primarily a CNS thing.
Hmm.
You do see like again, like there are aspects of it where it could be PNS, but peripheral nervous system. I need to stop using acronyms, but primarily a central nervous system issue down the line. So
Yeah. Um, what was I gonna ask? Oh, I was gonna ask. So, in the brain, like obviously there's neurons, and then there
Mhm.
are glia. These are like supporting
Mhm.
cells for people listening, right? And so a lot of what's happening in MS, right, is the types of glia that form the little protective sheaths around the neurons are dying. Is there
Mhm.
any evidence that there's involvement of any other types of glia, like the astrocytes or the like microglia? Basically, are there other cells involved, or is it primarily attacking those like myelin cells?
um it's we know that for majority it is the glial cells that are activated of it,
Mm-hmm.
but obviously what we do know is that like there's a lot of communication between microglia and astrocytes, and those do play a part in it. And in terms of like again like how this for MS purposes case right there, what their role is, it's not really well understood. But it is something that that's I think I know from like at least from the astrocytes like groups who are doing research into it.
Mm-hmm.
They are looking into that. So but you primarily see a lot of glial activation. That's like the primary aspect that we're really interested in as well. So especially based on the fact that again, um what we're seeing in terms of the injury and repair aspects within the brain,
Mm-hmm.
those roles of the glial cells are critical, and also along with the astrocytes. So
Yeah. So is it? I don't know if the field really knows this. Is it that like the virus kind of gets into the brain and like cells start going haywire and like trying to attack the virus, but they end up just attacking like myelin, or like do we know what's going on with that?
we're thinking I mean, like one of the thought processes really is that like with latent infections, like especially EBV, because it could happen anywhere, um that that latent infection could eventually broach into like kind of like the spinal and then the CNS aspect and traverse up, and that ultimately results in essentially like a cascade immune like effect that
Mm-hmm.
results in essentially like that the activation of glial cells, because remember they're there primarily. One of the big functions of glial cells is really kind of like it's like the brain's own immune cells, right, essentially in
Mm-hmm.
there. And so that aspect is kind of um it overreacts, and it creates a kind of its own little mini cytokine storm within the brain area to kind of and that results in that demyelination.
Mm-hmm.
That's one thought process. And again, there is possibility that that EBV infection could um get into past the blood brain barrier, but we don't have much evidence to kind of point to that, obviously, based on like autopsy evidence or anything like that. So primarily we're looking at it from an immune like kind of
Mm-hmm.
hyperactivation perspective.
Okay, so it's just like everywhere has gone haywire. It's not really specifically, or from
Yeah.
what we know now, it's not really that the virus got into the brain.
Yeah, I mean, it's a possibility. I'm
Mm-hmm.
not going to say it's not, because again, like remember that these microglias and a lot of the immune cells, we know that especially within the parenchyma and all these different areas that if there happens to be a macrophage or anything like that that might have dealt with an EBV, and it happens to traverse up there, we could see bits and pieces of the protein there.
Mm-hmm.
Same thing, like we actually, I think there was a research paper that just got published where we saw bits and pieces of like COVID, or the spike protein within those.
Mm-hmm.
But that doesn't mean that obviously there is an infection in there. It just means that it might have been that you might have had an immune cell that was fighting it off, and happens to traverse up there, and it might have kind of settled there and caused some sort of like again latent infection that without knowing. So these are all theories,
Mm-hmm.
and we're still trying to piece to like that puzzle piece together.
Yeah, that's really interesting.
Mm-hmm.
These are all just sort of like pieces of that middle part of the puzzle, right? That we are just trying to figure out.
Yeah.
Um, We just got another question in the chat from Maxie. So, is there
Mm-hmm.
any evidence that immunosuppressant treatment could slow the damage from these like cytokine swarms?
Um, I guess like again, immunosuppressant treatments like uh do help slow down significantly, right? Because cytokine storm really is an artifact of hyperactive immune reactions and whatever it might be. So talking in general, yes. For MS in situations like that, again, part of when we look at kind of like dealing with like the symptoms and a lot of it, it's more like slowing down and like dealing with the symptoms of it.
Mm-hmm.
So it is like dealing with the kind of like that immune like overactive immune system. So we do kind of in some situations prescribe immunosuppressants as well for those patients.
Mm-hmm.
And so it does kind of quote unquote alleviate those symptoms for most of those folks. But one of the things that we do note for many folks is that immunosuppressants like prednisone or things like that, we don't want people on them for long periods of time because there are challenges obviously beyond there because if you suppress your immune system long enough, it can't fight off other opportunistic infections, right? And you want to make sure that your body is still able to do its job um, without being compromised. And it's that weird, unfortunate balance when you talk about kind of like prescribing patients with that. So we always have to be cautious when we talk about that.
Yeah, for sure. That's going to set you up for other problems other than, having MS. So that's a very delicate balance. And one of the reasons why some of the, preventative aspects that are
Mm-hmm.
suggested by this paper of like vaccinating for EBV or like
Mm-hmm.
using a vaccine as treatment might help because like there's a lot less of a trade-off with giving a vaccine as opposed to treating with like prednisone or other immunosuppressants.
Yeah, and I think we still need to look at it. And again, this is like part of that puzzle we're looking at, right? It's like how do we help people who are who are going through MS? Again, like it's a very sad disease in terms of like we have a lot of folks who are impacted by it and those who have relapses, and it's just sometimes can be unpredictable. And I think part of it is understanding that a lot of the treatments for it are more just kind of like making sure that we don't let the episodes get too long or too
Mm-hmm.
exacerbated and dealing with the symptoms rather than treating the root cause of it, which again, it's just more of the fact of like when we look at MS, we don't fully understand the cause of it. So we can't cure what we don't know, right? So
Yeah.
that's the challenge behind that.
Yeah, absolutely. Um, I was actually kind of curious, and this is jumping away from MS a little bit, but
Yeah.
you had brought up long COVID before, and sort of
Yeah.
it feels like it's kind of a similar, not like in some ways similar to MS, and in some ways like obviously different, but like what are this is a broad question. What are some of the like leading theories on why long COVID ends up happening? Like I had COVID and
Yeah.
I was fine, but some people like get COVID and then get these like long prolonged symptoms. So,
Yeah. And I'll say this right now just to make sure we're clear that long COVID does exist. It is a thing. It does exist. I want to make sure that stands very clear from the get-go. Um, the big proponent of long COVID right now is that we still don't fully understand how each individual might have long COVID. There are very strong hypotheses out there, and one of the biggest one right now we have is that for some people who it doesn't matter if they've had mild or acute infections, but they have a kind of a like persistent viral reservoir, kind of like there's some virus that just sticks around
mm-hmm.
in tissue and just hang out. And essentially, what ends up happening is that your body would react to it because it's like, hey, there's still someone in my house.
Yeah,
Like keep the alarms going, right? It's kind of like your home alarm system. Like if you keep that alarm system going, it's not going to be comfortable for the household, right? Like that alarm just keeps going day in and day out. You can't sleep. Like it's not pleasant to eat food there. It's just not. It's not a whole pleasant home after that. Kind of same thing with long COVID is that your body's immune system just kind of continues going, and it's just like, hey, like we need to deal with this right now, and where is it? What do we need to do? And
Yeah.
it just keeps going. And that's one aspect. And again, what we also see is another theory is that, like, for those who've had acute infections of COVID, that they actually end up getting like tissue damage as a result of it. So that tissue damage could kind of carry over and persist after that infection is over, and that might be it. But again, the problem behind a lot of these hypotheses, well, not problem, but the challenges behind a lot of these is like we don't have like formidable data that really demonstrate this, because the incidence rates of long COVID, even though it is very real and it is happening, the proportion of people who do suffer from it has been actually decreasing over time. And there's a lot of people who've had it in previous years that are slowly coming out of it, but there's still a good proportion of people who still suffer through it.
Hmm.
So um, getting that data is very hard, because now like time has passed and we're trying to figure out, it's like trying to do tracing backwards and figuring out like what might be the cause here. And we're still trying to piece those puzzles together. And with infections right now with COVID, like what we've observed with recent like variants and things like that, is those incidence rates of long COVID are kind of not as high as they used to be. They're happening, but they're not as high.
Hmm.
And that makes it hard because you have limited population of people to really do investigations on. This gets into kind of like what I was saying earlier about how doing clinical trials with COVID and vaccines was amazing, because we literally had millions of people who could have done those clinical trials. And we did. We had thousands and thousands and thousands of people. But with long COVID, that population has significantly diminished. And getting data from a rare subset of post disease is very difficult as well, because it also does require us to do like long-term analysis, right? We need to figure out like, okay, well, once a person gets infected, like what do we see afterwards? And that can be very difficult as well. And the other big challenge behind long COVID is, once again, the idea that we still don't know what the cause of it is. So we can't treat it, right? Like if we don't know what the cause is. And one of the things that we're trying to do right now is look at from another perspective of okay, well, we do know, for example, Paxlovid, which is one treatment you can do for COVID,
Hmm.
uh, maybe taking like not just the normal, like, a few days, but taking it for 15 days. Like, does that help in
Hmm.
situations? And, for some people who've had long COVID, some of them have, said that it does help. So we're trying to investigate that and say, like, maybe this might be a modality that we can explore for treatment. But the problem again gets down to like, not all treatments will be equal, because long COVID is very complex in that it can present in multiple ways. And so we need to understand the different subtypes,
Hmm.
the causes for those subtypes, and all those different things. And it's things we have to, from that perspective, we have to think about.
Yeah, absolutely. And getting back to MS, John asks, is there a
Mhm.
relationship between MS and other diseases?
Um, Not that I can think of on top of my head. I mean, there's some genetic markers that we could certainly link to on that, and which actually they did investigate in this paper as well. It's again something that I'll need to pull up the paper again just to kind of remember which marker they were looking at. Um, and then there are some situations where people have investigated, like those who have had uh obviously prolonged persistent infections that could lead to that because of a weakened immune system or a hyperactive immune system. That is um aspects on that. And then I think as well, I'm trying to pull up the paper, I'm pulling up the paper right now.
Hmm.
um there also, we're looking at things such as, uh give me a second. I did see one factor as well for there we go. Yeah. Chlamydia as well as as well as another one. So chlamydia, and also like because we did notice that for some certain folks who have had HIV AIDS as well, for that, and then eventually developed the chlamydia pneumonia and things like that. We that is one aspect that we're looking into as a possible linkage. But again,
Hmm.
so many factors that like I don't think it's as strong as obviously like we're looking at Epstein-Barr virus uh beyond anything else. Because again, like I think one of the ones we looked at back then was also measles,
Mm-hmm.
but measles is like so few and far in between that we're kind of like that's a very difficult thing to investigate. So
Yeah.
um yeah, so I think really when we're looking at it right now from a evidence current body of evidence, EBV's right now currently one of the top contenders, really.
Yeah, for sure. Oh, I had a question that came up and I hate that when it's like, "Oh, I had it. It was right there."
It happens quite frequently to me. Don't worry.
Yeah. um I guess I was wondering if there are other of these kinds of linkages you know of between like a virus that's typically kind of acute and then a like long-term chronic illness.
Lyme disease.
Mm.
Lyme disease is one of the best examples I have. It's actually one of the things that also I know for many people who deal with chronic Lyme disease that feel very forgotten and very now their voice is not heard. So that's something that I think that we're still really kind of investigating, but that's a very good example. Even like, you know, like one of the big ones that I could think of too is like even measles, for example. There's a encephalitis that happens like so that the brain inflammation that can happen to certain people. It's like a very small proportion, but
Mhm.
it's a very frightening like disease that can happen that it's actually it's 100% fatality as once
Wow.
it happens. And so it's the one thing I've told people where I am deathly afraid of if I ever got measles was worrying about that down the line because we don't really fully understand it, but in some cases we do know that encephalitis can happen.
Mm.
So that is another one that we can think of from that perspective.
Yeah. It's important to get everybody vaccinated for
The
measles. Like,
MMR, please get it. It
yeah.
is so easy to get.
Yeah. Let's see. And then I guess talking about now I've wow. Losing my train of thought. And it
It's okay.
yeah. Yeah, please anybody who's watching like go ahead and put your questions in the chat too. Like this is all for what you all want to learn about.
Yeah,
Um
please.
maybe a little bit about like because this is a science communication podcast. I obviously like
Sure.
doing science communication. How did you like get into science communication?
Funny thing was that I do a lot of science communication in general for my work, because I do a lot of policy work with a lot of health topics, and the many things about that is really translating like clinical things and clinical things like diseases, treatments, and how we conduct science across like all the clinical trials, and translating to that for policymakers.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and those can from all different levels. And so that's kind of like where I really officially quote unquote started. But from an unofficial, like from where I am sitting right now in a lot of the work that we do right now, is like I was a Twitch streamer. I am still a Twitch streamer, but I did Twitch streams where I played video games for a while because I was like it was a hobby of mine, right? Like
Mm-hmm.
I play a lot of video games on the side, and I live streamed it, and I started answering random questions for people, and people would ask me random things. And this was actually right before COVID too, which is kind of like a really like weird, like coincidental thing. But before COVID hit, like I remember I just started talking to people about Ebola virus and things like that because
Mm-hmm.
media would always like to portray it in some like weird, like very unscientific way, and I would get so annoyed,
Mm-hmm.
and my audience would know that. So I would talk to people about like I'm like, here's what really does happen, and here's where obviously where we're at, and people started asking more questions, and I started realizing I was like, oh, like this is I have a knack for this, and I completely dropped the video game aspect, and I since then just do streams, and I do stuff on Twitter where I focus primarily on like, okay, here are the news that's coming out, and here are things we need to think about when we hear certain news outlets report on things and when agencies report on things, and be careful about these misinformation topics, and be careful about like how people portray this data, because there are a lot of bad faith actors out there that sometimes it's like they just don't know well enough and they'll
Mm-hmm.
communicate it wrong. But then there are people who purposely try to like communicate the wrong things for their own agenda. And so it's a very difficult like thing to kind of navigate through. And that's kind of where I've been really trying to focus in on, is just being able to disentangle a lot of those between those both as well.
All right, and we got in another question from Jeff. So Jeff asks, how are the comorbidities between diseases described? Are they directional, chiral, more Venn? I'm not entirely sure what this question is asking, but maybe you can give it
Yeah.
a crack.
Um, I guess like in terms of like uh I'm just trying. I do want to try to understand this as well. Are you talking about in general about how comorbidities are discussed from a viral perspective, or specifically for the how we're looking at the EBV paper or anything like that? I do want to make sure I answer this, because this is a I think where you're going to might be a good question. I just want to make sure like how I'm answering the right question. So if you want to like um kind of like expand upon that, I would love to hear more about from it. But
Yeah, I'm wondering if it's like if they're asking about it being like a causal relationship or if it's just an association. But yeah,
oh,
I'm
okay. Well,
I'm not sure if that's where they're going, but we'll wait and see.
yeah, I will say right now, when we look at just comorbidities in general, right now, from a disease perspective, we think about it, and we don't think about it like uh okay, yeah. I mean, comorbidities, Jeff, will try. I think one of the things we have to think about is that we don't associate whether if it is like the cause or whether if it's like the predecessor or anything like that. We know that it presence of it is there. So we do consider that as a if it is like considered like a thing that's present, then we do consider that as a comorbidity. It's just as long as it's simultaneously present in the patient for both of that, then we do consider that as a situation for that. So um, I'm not sure if that really gets to the heart of like where you're kind of getting to relationship. Um, yeah, and one of the things with this paper is trying to do is establish the thing that we're talking about right now with the Epstein-Barr virus and multiple sclerosis, right? Like two very separate diseases, two different infections, or not infections, excuse me, two different diseases, and understanding that again, we understand that there is presence of both. They're both.
Mm-hmm.
It is a comorbidity, I guess, if you want to think of that. But understanding like part of the paper is like saying like, okay, do we know that there is an actual link as well? And so part of it is making sure that are we addressing how well this link is established and how and what are the factors. And again, the paper identifies the fact that there is a link that does exist, but what that bridge looks like, we don't know yet. We have like we do know that do not know now that there is an endpoint between those two, and so that comorbidity probably has an interesting relationship as well.
Mm-hmm.
Optic neuritis, right? And so Dr. Feds as well. One of the things we look at from when we look at peripheral nervous system and things like that, and all these different things, is we do see some of those quote unquote comorbidities as well from the peripheral aspect and a lot of different things. So we're kind of still looking at all different facets and investigating that. So
Yeah. And then Maxie asks, could you tell us a bit about the history of the research of MS? How long have we known about multiple sclerosis? And did we originally misidentify multiple sclerosis as another disease? And then what breakthroughs have progressed throughout the duration of like how long we've studied it?
Um, that's a great question, and I will be frank and say that I am not a historian on this on MS. All things MS. That is not my focus primarily on. But I will say that MS most likely at some point probably was misclassified or misdiagnosed just because we really didn't have an understanding at that time. Um, and then obviously the factors of just in general like understanding like full scope of the gamut of how MS presents itself, right? Like, I think it wasn't until like 1930s that we really we started getting a grasp of the fact that not everyone like presents MS in the same way. But you know, it's been around for much longer than that. I think when I was looking at um, one paper, they were like talking like something as early as 1600s and or possibility of it, right? And
Mm-hmm.
again, probably misclassification and misdiagnosed as well, because at that time we really didn't have a full understanding of immunology or just in general how the brain works. So it's possible. And then in terms of like again the progression of how far we've come, we have I've talked to a lot of the neurologists who do work on this, and they it is very much like we have worked very hard to kind of deal with like providing better treatments and different aspects to make sure that those who are impacted by MS can still have a normal life, right? They're still able to, go out and do things, have a job, hold down a job, and things like that. And we have treatments that do like, such as like immunosuppressants that deal with that. And so that part of it is, better understanding in that investigation. So that
Mm-hmm.
is kind of like the evolution of it. And this is kind of like the next step. I feel is like now that we have one strong link, because again we're not certain that this is the only link, there might be others, right? That because of that we might be able to prevent future cases as well. So
Yeah, that sort of historical perspective is really interesting. Maybe I'll have to ask, like, find someone who is like a historian of medicine and
yeah,
and
there's a
see.
lot. There's a medical anthropologists and medical historians.
Mm-hmm.
They're fascinating people. And like even like medical cultural anthropologists, it's another fascinating thing, understanding like how different ethnic groups can have histories of diseases and things like that. It's very fascinating. um I'm certain if I like made a call for people, there's someone who knows that.
Yeah, that would be really cool actually. Maybe we can put it out there on Twitter and see who knows. So
Yeah.
this wasn't in the chat, but my friend Vera says that she thinks Jeff is trying to ask about how we use cohort studies to figure out that there's an increased risk of an outcome like MS
Mm.
in the group that is exposed to EBV versus not exposed.
Yeah, and so and taking that and integrating with Jeff's question right here, like how one disease can lead to susceptibility to another. Right now, there are many factors that could lead into it, right? So when we look at, let's focus specifically on the EBV question, just because there is very likely situations where one disease could cause a situation where your immune system could become less like responsive or less like apt to respond appropriately, or maybe way too appropriately, and
Mm-hmm.
you end up resulting in cascades of other things that could bring in opportunistic infections or other diseases. So that's very much a case of scenario right there where it could happen. Where for EBV situation, we had long suspected that those who have had Epstein-Barr virus, that from staining and all these different like again historical looking at just in general, like the infectious disease community has always suspected that EBV was a huge culprit, because again we do know that EBV, that those who do get infected at first have latent like resurgence of that virus as well, and we've seen it actually with some COVID patients as well. And so we look at that situation and see, okay, well, okay, what does that lead into in that situation? And we've looked at it across all these different samples within the army, which actually was one of the great things, is that the army provided all of these like samples, which were checked and were studied, by the way, Jeff. So there was no cross contamination or poisoning from that. I don't know if that's what you're referencing. And so and then also going to those individuals and kind of like again looking across longitudinally, and then what they ended up seeing was that those who had presence of those proteins and presence of those immunomarkers uh, started marrying with each other perfectly, and like that linkage was like almost way too strong. And they even checked themselves too as well, Jeff. One of the things that the paper does really well is like they're like wondering like, well, okay, well, why does it have to be Epstein-Barr virus? But let's check other herpes virus and all these other factors, right, that could lead to chronic infections. So they checked out cytomegalovirus, they checked out flu, they checked out basically everything you can think of. Well, not everything, but majority of them that you can think of. And they ran this across a virus database across multiple iterations to double check to make sure. And no matter how they ran it, no matter who they ran it against across this large group, it always ended up pointing to the fact that, hey, there's Epstein-Barr virus, there's fragments of this virus consistently across all these cohorts. And as a result, again, those who did have that ended up progressing to having MS, and that was a very astounding factor because again we looked at all the different factors, and the paper does do a very good job of outlining like in checking its own bias to make sure that like, okay, well, are we making sure that there's no other things that could impact or might have resulted in this. Now this is not saying that it's just Epstein-Barr virus itself. We have the paper very elucidates very clearly that it probably had help as well
Mm.
from a genetic aspect, that certain people express a certain gene that obviously marry that with the EBV could result in progression to that of MS. Now, how those two interact, how the frequency of that, and all these different factors is not something we understand just yet, but we know that this is a circumstance that is there for the most part.
Yeah, that was a really thorough answer. And then Maxie just wanted to know what a cohort study is.
Yeah, no, cohort study really, it usually is the way I would look at it is like looking at a group of people um, who are alike, but differ by a lot of different characteristics. So it's the way I would look at it is kind of like looking at pediatric population. Pediatric is a cohort, right? So we look at pediatric cohort for those patients that have the intervention versus not. So two different cohorts in that situation. And it's really just more of thinking about it like if you want to think of an experiment as different groups that you are investigating outcomes for, whether if they had the intervention or whether if they've not. And what you want to do really is compare cohorts that are, apples to apples, right? So, is a good example is like you don't want to compare pediatric patients to adult patients. It's like very different groups of
Mm-hmm.
people, different health, systems and things like that, and all different things. You can't really do that. But if you were to compare adults to adults, that makes more sense, right? So the adult cohort that has received treatment versus those that haven't. So it's kind of the best way to look at it on that perspective.
Yeah. I think actually on that, we're going to wrap up. Dr. Neuro, do you want to let people know where they can find you to hear more of your science communication?
Yeah, you can find me at Twitter at Neurofourier. That is my previous name and it's still there. You can also find me on Twitch. I do go live and I do answer questions live on there as well. And it is something that I really love doing with folks in the community. It's twitch.tv slash Dr. underscore neuro. And you can find me really any links from there as well. And we're hoping that we can answer more questions like these.
Yeah, well, thank you so much for coming back onto In Plain English to do this live stream. I
Absolutely.
really appreciate it. I'm sure that the people who've been watching really appreciated it as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And happy to answer any follow up questions as well. So, if you guys have any, feel free to shoot us those questions.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, so that's going to do it. And the next episode of In Plain English is going to be live the first Tuesday of next month. So stay tuned for that. All right.
We're good. Yeah, yeah. I always feel like I